Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Jolie Black. I talk about books, academic stuff and ancient magic mostly. Today I'm going to be talking about the magic system in Babel. It looks like my cat is going to be joining us. This is my second take because I recorded for an entire hour and then I discovered that the sound had only picked up for the final 15 minutes. I was trying to do a better sound system so that there wasn't any background noise because I'm so close to a road and cars keep going by. We've got neighbours doing things in both sides of the houses. I live in a Victorian terrace, and so that has been a bit of a problem. So I apologise if there's lots of background sound, lots of purring, all that kind of thing. But what I wanted to do today is 2 years late. I am currently in the process of reading Catabasis, and I will say right now, I am going to be biased. I do love what I've read so far. I'm hoping to do a video on that next week where I talk about particularly R.F. Kuang's approach. I'm probably going to delve into some of the magic side of things because ancient magic is what I study, but I'll leave that until next week. This week, if I can get my brain engaged after talking for an hour and then losing all of the material, I'm going to be talking about Babel. Babel was published in 2022. I believe Kuang was working on her PhD thesis. She is a sinologist. She works on language and linguistics. That very much comes out in this, but I also have a strong sense that she has a very strong grounding in classics and an understanding of how magic systems work. That was really what I wanted to discuss. The reason why I'm doing this 2 years late, I watched lots of videos around the time Babel came out and saw the discourse and the discussion. And one video stuck out to me because it was Lien's library. I apologize if I'm saying that wrong, but she did one video that was a discussion of Babel and mentioned that she didn't like the magic system. Then she did a longer discussion of the magic system and why she felt that it was ineffective, particularly compared to some of the inspirations that Kuang cited. Now, I am here in classic academic style to start a conversation, a discourse about that and respond to that as an academic who studies how magic systems work, especially the materiality of magic. I'm going to explore the nature of translation, the nature of how Kuang incorporated aspects of decolonization and colonial studies into her work. But I'm going to incorporate some material from my own studies and the background of my particular area, which is a specialism in the magic of Greco-Roman Egypt. It has particular resonance. There is a reason why when I read the book for the first time, I was really excited about this magical system. Magical systems built around words are incredibly effective, and magical systems built around words are extremely common and they tend to be the fundamental. I'm not going to say absolutely universally because I haven't studied every single magic system that existed and nobody has. All of the systems that I have encountered, religious systems, any system that is intending to reach out to an unseen supernatural force or person or power, tends to do it with words. And the using of words to make something effective as an object is extremely common. I'm going to get into that. I will just start with a bit of a recognition because we are talking about some of the colonial threads involved in this, that obviously I am white, I am British, and I study a system and a world that is not my own culture. That is important to recognize. That is a facet of what Kuang brings out when she is discussing these features of language, especially within Babel. It's quite subtle, but it is there. So I wanted to kind of highlight that I recognize that and that I am reflecting back what I picked up from the work that I've done to try and decolonize my own practice, which is still always in progress. I recommend as a starting point, if you want to have some understanding of the background to the British Empire and all the horrendous things it did, this is a good overview to replace what we didn't learn in school by Caroline Elkins. I do appreciate she's also a white woman, but she does a sort of great introduction. The other book that I really recommend for getting a sense of the British and what they did in the East Indies in particular around opium and tea is Amitav Ghosh's Smoke and Ashes, which discusses particularly the Indian perspective on what led to and it was involved in the Opium Wars. That is an excellent deep dive into that side of the British Empire and everything they did, essentially looking at the Dutch and saying, hold my tea, I'm sure I can do worse in this area. So I am just being aware that I'm a white person coming in, and my focus here is really going to be about the magic. That does feature a lot of discussion of the impact of colonialism and the use of those systems by colonizing powers. As I think it makes an interesting allegory for thinking about how cultures become co-opted when they are colonized in much more subtle ways than just the taking of materials. And she is doing a lot of that. I'm going to be focusing mainly on the practical aspects of how this works and explaining the magical system and magical systems that are built on words more generally, just because that's what I do. That's my work, essentially. I was going to say that's my day job, but it's not my day job. Teaching is my day job. One day, maybe it will be my day job. So I'm also not going to review Babel. Personal perspective, I struggled with it towards the end. I really enjoyed a lot of it. It is a slow read. I think of it, there are books that you can read that are really quick. I can get through a Mick Herron very quickly, or I can normally, I can't at the moment. I can get through a Richard Osman really fast. But there are other books that are meant to be read more slowly, and I think this is one of those books. The tensions at the end felt a little bit loose in places. I'm not going to go into that in any depth. I read, you can see that when I was reading it, I made tons and tons of notes because I did want to write something about it. And who knows, maybe I'll actually do it up for proper academic publication. But I did want to say that I have a really deep appreciation for the detail of her work. I am going to save my discussion of Kuang's approach to writing, especially when she writes these books. I know that she's done others as Rebecca Kuang. When she's approaching these books and her style of writing and who she's writing for, but I'm going to save that for the catabasis discussion, I think. Partly because having read the first few pages of catabasis, my instant thought was, yeah, this is written for PhD students. Yeah. I could see me going to hell to get my supervisor back if they had gone to hell, because I needed to pass my summer panel committee and couldn't do it without them. That would be a thing you do. I think that's going to be the main sweep of my discussion. But we will obviously deal with that in another video when I've had a chance to read the book. So just, a brief overview of the plot. Robin is a young Chinese boy who is brought back to England to study as a magical scholar. His particular specialism is language, so he is involved in the making of magical objects. This magical version of the British Empire functions entirely on the creation of these silver bars that have matched pairs of words on them. So you would have one word that's in English and then one word that is in a particular type of Chinese, or one word in Spanish and a word that matches it somewhere else. To give you a sense of the tension, it's actually described in a wonderful scene that's quite short, but it is lovely, where Robin goes around with one of the professors, Professor Chakrabarti, who is charged with going around to repair, recharge, fix various silver bars. As a personal note, I love that they have this in there. I love that Kuang included this. One of my favourite procedures involves repairing a necromantic skull. And the idea that an object could run out of power, that it could fail, and that it might need to be recharged is a really fascinating one to me as someone who studies magic. So if I can just find it, because I didn't write it down in advance, and that's terrible of me, isn't it? So they go to a house to recharge a silver bar or a set of silver bars, and Robin asks Chakravarti, what he's supposed to do. And let's start here. So he let Robin reinstall the bar, then bent down to check his work. Satisfied, he stood and brushed his hands on his trousers. Would you like to activate it? What? Say the words. Robin had seen the professors do the same many times, though he couldn't imagine it was all that easy. Then again, he recalled the Wuqing bar had worked for him on the first try. And I apologise there, I'm going to mangle the Chinese. Well, it's a particular kind of mental state. You speak the words, but more importantly, you hold two meanings in your head at once. You exist in both linguistic words simultaneously, and you imagine traversing them. And then he goes on and a little bit later and he says, there are some good mental heuristics you'll learn during your fourth year and some theory seminars you'll have to sit through. But when it comes down to it, it's about the feeling. I'm going to come back to that because it goes into the tensions between languages and how they work and how we translate. But I'm going to start in a much more basic way by talking about the construction of the bars. So the bars are constructed by taking a piece of silver and like a plank of silver, block of silver, and writing on it. This is very similar to curse tablets. And this is what I picked up on when I first read the book. And they go into the 8th floor of the tower. They're about to learn how to make these magical objects. And they start this conversation. Professor Playfair is the one who leads them through the first time. And he says, this is what you have to do. And he talks about putting the matched pairs of words from different languages onto these bars. And I was like, oh, wow, that's curse tablets. Oh, that's curse tablets. Probably a lot from other cultures as well. I have seen sort of traditions in Britain and elsewhere of writing on stones. We have stones, protective stones that line sort of like routes around the Silk Roads, the various Silk Roads that incorporate these protective amulet type stones, which just sit there and they're written in multiple languages. And we see lots of amulets deposited. There's a huge deposition of those at the far end in the Chinese end of the Silk Roads, where people would kind of take off their amulets because they no longer needed them, or they didn't, they were just being left there, or they were specifically deposited there. So you're talking about limit of effect. So that felt very real. So let's talk about curse tablets. Curse tablets I encountered first when I started my master's in 2014, and we did a class on epigraphy. Epigraphy is the study of writing on a support that isn't really paper. There is some crossover with paleography. There is nothing that isn't blurred in terms of boundaries in academia. Epigraphy deals with writing on stone, tablets, wood, clay, that kind of thing. Whereas paleography generally takes the vellum paper, rag paper from China, or modern paper, or papyrus, or any other reed that gets used to make paper. That's kind of where things separate. So curse tablets, broadly speaking, come under the heading of epigraphy because they are generally written on different types of metal. Mostly they were written on lead. This practice emerged in Greece, and there have been a series of studies. So Ordelon did a collection of them and a catalogue of what had been found in the early 20th century. And then John Gager updated in 1992. I'm obviously going to put all of these links in the Patreon and everywhere else. And in between then, we have had, I think it's Cabrera and Robert Jordan, who do occasionally put out catalogues. They say, oh, we found another 200 of these, because that's what happens. You go in to do archaeology on an ancient Greek site or an ancient or Egyptian site or a Roman site, and you find a whole bunch of curse tablets. They were deposited in wells. They were also deposited in tombs. They tend to end up in liminal spaces, which are how they are meant to get from our world into the supernatural world, into the underworld, to the people who are meant to do the work. This is a magical system where if you want something to happen, you want to do something, you want to achieve something, or generally speaking, you want to make someone suffer, you are attempting to do that via a supernatural agent, a god, a deity, a dead person. The untimely dead are a very common choice in Greek culture, ancient Greek culture. They start very simply, these curse tablets. Fascinating little objects. They would write just names, no explanation. No explanation of the names. There's just a series of names on a lead tablet that is then rolled up. Some of them put in bricks, courthouses. Some of them are put down wells because the easiest way to get to the underworld is via water. And then they're just left. This is kind of interesting because it points to both the evolution of a process, spreading literacy, and also the development of a magical technology. We tend to think of technology as used for specific other things, but this is a form of magical technology. We think these lists of names relate to court cases, and this is from Esther Eidenau, who talks in more depth. She wrote a book in 2008 discussing curse tablets and pleas for justice, especially. If you were going into a court case and you were particularly disadvantaged financially, socially, culturally, you weren't sure you were going to win, you could obviously write a list of names on a curse tablet and roll it up. So that was what the oldest ones were. Over time, these curse tablets become more and more complex. And this is kind of happening at the same time as writing is developing in Greece. So writing develops all over the world, kind of simultaneously, weirdly, without contacting each other. Anytime a society gets big enough, it needs to have writing in order to kind of administrate it and hold it together. And as a corollary of that, you need to kind of get your supernatural agents involved in what you want in life. So you need to kind of write to those. Writing is seen as powerful, very effective means of communicating. So they write these strings of words. They write these strings of names. That is followed up by adding in what you would like to happen and who specifically you are asking to do it. Abrasax or Abraxas is a popular choice. If I can find a video by Esoterica, I will drop that in the description as well, because he has done deep dives into the various characters who appear in that period as being the sort of supernatural agent that you could go to if you wanted to get something terrible done to somebody. What they did was they would say, essentially it's the same as a letter. They're saying, I'm writing to you to ask if you would very kindly bind these people because I want them to fail at something. Curse tablets took various forms. So they were used for pleas for justice, which was ensuring that they got what they wanted out of a court case. Punishing thieves was a popular choice. That comes out a lot in the curse tablets that we find in Britain. We have studies on those, examining how people used curse tablets not so much to get the objects back. They didn't expect to get the objects back. They did want the thief punished, though. And the best way to do that was to go to a supernatural agent and say, I want you to do horrendous things. And over time, the descriptions of what was required got more and more complicated and more in depth. You also have tablets that are aimed at someone that you have a crush on. I have issues with the use of calling it love magic because there is nothing loving about it. It is truly diabolical. The very detailed descriptions that some spoken texts involved. So you'd make a curse tablet, but you would also have to speak what you wanted because you were being very specific with your speech. Those are violent and aggressive, have no concept of what the target might want themselves. They often involve SA and R and other things that I do not want to anger the YouTube algorithm for mentioning. But there is very little in that is, what you would think of as love, really. So they use them for those purposes. And also chariot races. If they want to win a chariot race, the best way to win a chariot race is not to ask the supernatural agent to help you win, but to ask the supernatural agent to kill the competing side. So that's a way to go about it. They were typically made on these lead sheets. Lead was used for quite a long time for writing. There is some suggestion in the scholarship that one of the reasons why this practice developed in the way that it was is that it reflected writing. So just as you would write a letter to your friend from Athens to Sparta or Thebes or wherever, you would write a curse tablet to a supernatural agent. They would read it, which also suggests that supernatural agents could read because, of course, yes. Then you would develop that in more and more detail. So you also see you also see a tendency towards this concept of binding. So people are being bound. They have all of their body parts are bound. So you start off saying, Abrasax, bind this person against me. And then you move on to binding, like literally listing all of their body parts, like bind his eyes, bind his nose, bind his legs, bind his arms, just being as specific as possible. There is probably a lot of interesting work that could be done on that repetitive spoken structure and written structure. They start off writing this called boustephrison, I've got that wrong, where it's written sort of, you write from left to right and then you go and you write like that because that was how the Greeks originally wrote, and then gradually they decided we write in lines. They start to add pictures. Pictures show the supernatural agent what you'd like to happen, or they incorporate other imagery. They might have an image of the supernatural agent themselves and what they want to happen. All of this helps to reinforce the communicative aspect of it. It also communicates the importance of the words themselves. Now, I mentioned that the reason that they used lead was because it was very much available, according to Ordelon, and I think later Gage also makes the same comment. But it is also dark, it's soft, so it's easy to write on and easy to fold up, but it has this kind of dark unpleasantness to it. And what you're doing is fundamentally aggressive and unpleasant. Yeah, there's another side of it. So that is where I came into this fascination with Babel and that magical system, that approach. It seemed obvious to me as someone who studies, how do these objects work? How do these curse tablets work? They clearly work as a letter, but then you also see that same idea reproduced as a more complex ritual where not only do you make the object, but you have to speak over it before you deposit it. Before you throw it away, you have to say words. That, as a universal aspect of all magical praxis, was something that I could see coming out very strongly in Babel. And it's why I find the magical system especially effective. And I did wonder, have you studied ancient magic? You did courses on ancient magic? Because it is also multilingual. I have done a shorter video on that aspect of it a little bit, but I'm not happy with the video, so I haven't put it out yet. I was going to put it out. I'm doing this one instead if I can get it ready in time. But what I decided to do is to kind of extend it so I can go into more detail. There's no point in having two videos, a short one and then a long one that kind of covers the same topic. So I decided we'd do that a little bit differently. Anyway, this got me into thinking about how this magic works. So you have words from two separate languages that have this tension in the translation, the fact that they don't quite mean the same thing, and you're trying to sit in that space between the two words, and then they're written on silver. Silver seems to act as a battery, a magical battery. So initially, when they go up into the tower, so they go up into the Babel Tower, and Professor Playfair introduces the cohort to what they're doing, and he insists that there's nothing in the silver. He says, you're in the place where magic is made. It's got all the trappings of a modern university, but at its heart, Babel isn't all that different from the alchemist's lairs of old. Unlike the alchemists, we've actually figured out the key to the transformation of a thing. It's not in the material substance, it's in the name. I could get really offended as someone who's fascinated by material culture and by that comment, but I chose not to. I chose to be good, always be kind. I was sort of thinking about that and going, why are you saying it's not important? Because he later actually goes on to go back on that. And he describes just how important the physical material really is. He takes out some bars and he discusses the difference between these silver bars. He says, many of the cheaper bars you see around London don't last quite as long. Very few of them are actually silver all the way through. More often, they're just a thin sheen of silver coating over wood or some other cheap metal. They run out of charge in a matter of weeks, after which they need to be touched up, as we put it. And that is where it becomes really obvious that the silver has this magical charging effect on the words. That's kind of amplifying the words. When I go back and talk about curse tablets, I think about not from the pure material perspective of lead as a physical substance that's easy to write on and is soft, but lead as a dark substance, lead as a substance that can be used because it has this kind of energy to it that is charging up the words. You don't just write on wood, you write on lead because you want that darkness. There is a physical manifestation of what you're trying to do that is recreated in the physical objects that you use to make the thing. I'm going to talk about the way that they charge up these bars. They've made these bars. The best ones, the most expensive ones, are pure silver, or they are mostly silver. And the weaker ones are silver or silver alloy. Where do the words come into it? Well, you have this kind of tension between the two words, and then you have to have them spoken aloud. And this is specifically where Leanne had a problem. I hope she won't mind me talking about this 2 years later. But this is kind of where my work on materiality comes in. I'm very interested in how an immaterial force that's imagined by people and cultures in the real world actually kind of plays out on a material level. So as part of that, I study the work of scholars like Tim Morton, Tim Ingold, notice they're all called Tim, and Jane Bennett, who's not called Tim, obviously, who do work around the nature of materiality. And I highly recommend reading Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, which was written in 2008. Obviously, I will put down a bibliography. There is also Timothy Morton's Realist Magic, which I'm going to be using extensively here. Jane Bennett has also done a wonderful deep dive into the work of Walt Whitman, if you're interested in that, called Influx and Efflux, which is also a discussion of materiality in poetry. So this is kind of where things get a little esoteric. I'm not Philosophy Tube. I do not do philosophy. But what I study is that kind of complexity of how materials work when you have that tension between the immaterial and the material. And this is what we call object-oriented ontology, which is the study of objects in the world, basically. So let's get started here. Now, what we want to think about is how these words being spoken aloud works on a magical material level. It's important to think about this because it's not just speaking. There is a component to it that is the speaker is critical, and presumably there is some aspect around speaking as well as writing at the same time that plays into that magical effect. Now, in object-oriented ontology, we think of words that are spoken as being objects. This is going to seem really, really strange. But there is a materiality to speech. There is a materiality to sound. We are affected on a material level by sound when we both make it and when we hear it. Objects are also affected by sound. We tend to think about objects as this is an object, this is an object. What we struggle with is when objects and material things are invisible to us. So it takes us a long time to come up with the idea of air. We also struggle a little bit with the idea that sound can be harmful to us in a physical way. There is a fantastic podcast called The Sound, which is about Havana syndrome, which discusses illnesses that are caused by sound. I am autistic and I have very extreme sensory sensitivity to sound. So I know all about how sound can give me a migraine. Very small sounds can affect me in very big ways. We also have the ongoing problem of data centers. Who knew we'd get to AI in this particular video? But here we are. The series Data Vampires by Paris Marx on the podcast Tech Won't Save Us is a fantastic look at the terrible role that these big data centers play, and that includes discussion of particular data centers because they are so loud and they make so much noise. They are actually making people unwell in the communities where they have been built. So that is something to kind of bear in mind. We have a physical material relationship with sounds that very often goes unstated and unremarked and unconsidered. So when Kuang is suggesting that speaking something, speaking a word and reigniting the power, she is making this sort of material connection between someone who is a native speaker of that particular word and that particular language being able to do something particular and special with that word when it is physically present, because once a word is written down, it is physically present and is also a material object that's visible in the world. And doesn't even have to be visible. Hell of a lot of the magic that I work with involves things not being seen or visibly present, but actually being there. So I'm going to just quote from Magical Realism. Timothy Morton explains how the sound of a frog begins as vibration in the frog's throat. These then create further vibrations in the mouth as molecules in the air, and they are reached by any listening creature. Air was forced into an elastic sac. Thank you, Indy. Air was forced into an elastic sac at the bottom of the frog's mouth. The lungs pushed and the sac inflated, and when released, out came the croak. The air was modulated by frog tissues, sampled briefly and repackaged, returning to the ambient atmosphere as a low rasp with high harmonics. Or we could say that about a meow. Morton also has something to say about the nature of translation, which is a key feature of Babel and its story. The sound of frogs, sound of meows, is translated, he says, into onomatopoeic words and phrases on the page. He considers this to be a rift between the material as it is and the material as humans attempt to understand it and put it into words. So as he says, somehow these non-human sounds made it into human language. I do apologise. Somehow these non-human sounds made it into human language, altered but reasonably unscathed. A new translation has appeared. A fresh rift has opened up between appearance and essence. An object is born. This is a beautiful way of thinking about what Kuang has done with the magic and that specific tension between words in different languages, and that it not just being a mental image or a sensation that is produced by the speaker as a native language speaker, but also something that has real physical presence and is an object in the world. He goes on to discuss the way that the boundaries are blurred between words, sounds, and their physical existence in the world. A single sound wave of a certain amplitude and frequency rode the air molecules inside the frog's mouth. The wave was inaudible to a mosquito flying right past the frog's lips, but sensed instead as a fluctuation in the air. The wave carried information about the size and elasticity of the frog's mouth, the size of his lungs, his youth and vigour. The wave spread out like a ripple, becoming fainter and fainter as it delivered its message further and further into the surrounding air. Reaching the ears of a nearby female frog, however, the sound wave was soon translated into hormones that told her a young stud frog was close by. The wall of croaking caused the grasses in the pavement next to the pond to vibrate slightly. That gives you a really powerful sense of how sounds are received differently by different people. I suspect that this may also play into Babel's appreciation for the differences between being a native speaker and speaking words that you have a very deep fundamental appreciation for, because they were the first words you heard. They're the words that you've grown up with as how you express your existence in the world. And coming at it as somebody who is not a native speaker, and on a purely personal level, as someone who has learned or tried to learn a number of languages, I did French to A level, I've done some Latin, which has all fallen out of my head. I've done a lot of Greek. I don't speak Greek. Very interesting, because I've done ancient Greek and you don't generally speak it. We don't really know how it was spoken. There are apparently some small groups left that do speak some kind of variant, and that may have evolved over time differently to modern Greek. But generally speaking, you don't talk in ancient Greek. So that removes something that is fundamental to how we appreciate language and the magic of language, really. You are left not really knowing what it's like to hear that. Now, I mentioned with the curse tablets that we have a supernatural agent who is there to do the work of the magic. So you are putting all of this together in a very specific package. They get more specific and more convoluted over time. And you put it in the ground, you take it to a tomb. There are even tombs that say, do not put curse tablets down here because we're sick of it. Because the tombs were built with these tubes that you could put offerings down to the dead, and people were putting curse tablets down them, and it was really upsetting on roads, crossroads especially, and obviously in wells and filling up wells with them. But you make this package and you sending it to a supernatural agent to do something in the world. Now, this does not happen in Babel. The human speaks this match pair and the vocalization activates the bar. So I'm thinking vibration. I am thinking that the silver vibrates on a magical level. That's my take on this, as obviously our magical expert weighing in. Now, that sort of doesn't make it merely a matter of speech, or anyone could know the words and say the words. That fundamental, deeper knowledge, which I think we don't often touch consciously as speakers of our own language, and we don't appreciate it unless potentially you are living in a colonized, you are from a colonized community and you have experienced that, where your language is simultaneously held up as having this magical powers, but also being demeaned at the same time as you are less than because you are not white. But also we need your magic because your words are magical. That constant contrast that is such a fundamental part of how colonialism works. Now, this tells us something important about the way language operates as a physical magical activator in Babel's world. So the body of the speaker, the vocal cords familiar with speech patterns, the structure of the brain. We know that bilingual brains in particular work differently depending on the language that they're speaking. We have all of this insight into how speaking affects your language. Speaking particular languages affects how you think to some degree, although I know that this is sociolinguistics to some extent. So I'll be cautious there. Now, I spent months trying to learn specific language patterns for Xhosa, and I've said that wrong. I do apologise. You are limited by the language that you have learned to speak as a child in terms of learning other languages, because you hit them and you just like, what on earth is going on here? I certainly felt that way with ancient Greek, particularly because It has a middle voice as well as an active and a passive, and all of those cases. It's not nearly as bad as some languages, which have like 13 or 14 cases, but yeah, there's a lot. Now, we can also think about languages such as sign language, which is much more specific sense of this is something that has to be appreciated by the eyes, but it's something that you're doing with your hands. Very exciting sort of stuff. It takes extra time as a learner of British Sign Language. So did some time doing British Sign Language, and it takes time to come to that understanding, but also to understand that you need to use your face a lot more and be very, very physical with your face, which always makes me feel weird. I'm not good at like making faces. It makes me think anyway that we have the silver is vibrating, and that resonance gradually dies down over time, and the purer the silver is, the better the resonance and the longer that magical effect is going to last. So that was a very long-winded way of me explaining how the magic worked and why that is pretty much standard anywhere. The magical handbooks that I work with from Greco-Roman Egypt, they were the PGM, they're now the GEM-F. Most of them are built around speech and speech acts and saying words over objects. When you're talking about making a magical object, saying something over that object in order to activate it, that is pretty standard. And this is where my analysis kind of comes from, is to say that there is that resonance within the material on a magical level that makes this effective, which is why when Gandalf goes up to the doors of Moria and says, Belloc, the doors open. That's, this is all based on actual magical practice that happens in the real world. And that is not the same as saying magic is real. It is just saying this is how it's done. It's interesting to me because curse tablets are largely written on lead. There are some that are written on gold, and there are some that are written on silver. The gold ones usually are intended to attain wealth. They often reach out to Helios. And the silver ones, the ones that I have, are amulets which you use to protect yourself if you're going to talk to Selene, because Selene will beat you up if you get it wrong. Now, Helen Hills published a piece, Silver's Alchemy of Trauma and Salvation. Now, that's actually about the Spanish and their use of silver. She used the silver trade to explicitly examine the materiality of colonialism in that particular case. Baroque silver held peculiar significance as material of sacred and liturgical objects, marker of social niceties and refinement, as engine of the commodity of the frontier of the Spanish Empire, and as justification for calculated exploitation and cruelty. Thank you for your comment. So Kuang applies that same theoretical approach of the case of silver to the British Empire. The objects created in Babel are magical in a practical sense rather than a material with explicit religious connotations. They're not reaching out to a specific deity or supernatural agent of any kind. It strips away that mystique. She's able to present magic much more as a form of technology that has been stolen and co-opted by the British, but remains dependent entirely on resources that are taken from other countries by force. This applies not just to the physical materials. We're very familiar with the way that raw resources are taken from colonized countries, that you take silver, lead, I keep thinking about lead because it's on the top of my brain, but you take wood, you take fossil fuels, you take anything that you want from a colonized country and you use it. The same applies to humans and the people that are taken, but also their culture. This has been an ongoing debate around museums and the masses of material that have been taken, plundered from other countries during the extensive period of colonization, that show that what Kuang shows in Babel from the colonial angle is that people and their culture become embroiled in that colonization process, and they're continually used and continually exploited, at the same time as treated with kind of a faux respect. They need the magical power of the words, but they're not willing to give them the same sense of legitimacy that they give white British power. Okay, so all of this is a really complicated way of explaining how there is an underlying effectiveness to the use of word-based magical systems and how that interacts with physical materials. I think Babel is an especially good demonstration of how that works. It is much more focused on, it is much closer to how magical systems, certainly the ones that I have studied, tend to work in the real world. I am so sorry, my cat will not be quiet. So that's it for this week, because she wants me to do something and I don't know what. Probably she wants me to sit somewhere so she can sit in my lap. I'm going to end the video here. I hope you have enjoyed it. Next week, I'm going to try and do a discussion of catabasis, and I'm going to think about who these books might be for and why they tend to trigger off these strong responses every time she writes them. Then I will hopefully also talk a little bit on a personal level about why they appeal to me. I think there's a lot there to kind of unpack. Particularly, I think she's writing for PhD students a lot of the time. That is the TL didn't watch side of that. Otherwise, that is how the magical system works. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I apologize for my cat being very loud. I hope to see you next week. If you want to check out any of my other stuff, you can find my Patreon down below. I will try to put all of the material that I've used down below if I've referenced it. Possibly not the Ordelon one because it's a difficult one to find. No one's used it in 100 years. And you can find the same thing over on my Patreon. I am trying to put videos out early for Patreon subscribers. I'm going to try and figure out some other benefits that aren't exclusively aimed at anyone who would be interested in my fiction, because that's an ongoing thing. Otherwise, if you have anything you want me to talk about, particularly around the realm of ancient magic, please also let me know in the comments, and I will see you again next week. Bye.